There is a moment, preserved in the audio archive of the Velthari Joint Command, that lasts 4 seconds. It has been studied, replayed, and cited in more military history texts than almost any other recorded exchange from the Keth Frontier War. The moment is simple. A Velthari logistics officer presents a human soldier with a weapon, the oldest functional rifle in the Coalition's inventory, a battered, scratched, pre-war-era ballistic carbine that no Velthari soldier had been willing to carry for 11 years. The officer explains, with what the transcript records as genuine apology in his vocal register, that the Coalition's modern energy weapons are calibrated to Velthari hand geometry and cannot be safely operated by human fingers. He says they are working on adapters. He says it may be 3 weeks. He says he is sorry. There is a pause of 4 seconds. Then the human soldier says 7 words, "Point me at something that needs killing." That soldier's name was Sergeant First Class Deo Ademi Akafer. He was 34 years old. He had been a soldier for 16 of those years across 4 separate theaters on 3 worlds, and he had a record that the Velthari Joint Command's personnel analysts, reviewing it for the first time the morning he arrived, had needed 2 passes to fully credit. Not because it was implausible. Because it was the kind of record that their existing frameworks for evaluating soldier capability had not been built to accommodate. Their frameworks were built on Velthari parameters, species for whom physical strength, sensory acuity, and environmental adaptation were the primary variables. Sergeant Ademi Akafer's record had numbers in those columns. It also had columns that the Velthari framework did not have names for yet. The analysts flagged it for senior review and moved on. They would think about it later. They were in the middle of a war. The Keth Frontier War had been going for 6 years by the time humanity entered it. The Keth were not technically an aggressive species. Their own historical self-understanding was as a defensive civilization, one that had survived 3 previous extinction-level conflicts through strategic withdrawal and positional endurance rather than offensive action. What they were, in the practical military sense, was extraordinarily difficult to dislodge. They built positions that lasted. They constructed defensive architectures of such depth and complexity that assaulting them frontally was, in every engagement the Velthari coalition had attempted in 6 years, catastrophically expensive. The coalition had taken territory. It had taken the territory the way you take a tooth from a living jaw at great cost, with significant damage to the tool and with the uncomfortable awareness that the patient was still alive and had more teeth. Humanity had not been in the coalition from the beginning. The Velthari had not asked, not because they were hostile to humanity, but because the honest assessment of their military strategists in the war's early phase was that humanity's forces, while capable by the standards of a developing military civilization, did not offer capabilities that the coalition's existing composition did not already have in greater quantity. Humanity had soldiers. The coalition had soldiers. Humanity had conventional weapons and limited energy weapons technology. The coalition had better versions of both. The military calculus did not favor the addition. Humanity was not invited. What changed the calculus was attrition. 6 years of fighting a defensive civilization with infinite patience for positional endurance had worn the coalition's frontline units to a fraction of their pre-war strength. The Velthari's own species was a relatively small one. Their total military-age population was limited, their recruitment base was being drawn down, and their allied species in the coalition were experiencing similar pressures. In USR 3412, the coalition's Joint Command issued an assessment that has since been declassified and is available in the Frontier War Archive. It projected that at current attrition rates, the coalition would exhaust its combat-effective frontline capacity within 18 to 24 months. The assessment recommended expanding the coalition's recruitment base. Humanity was contacted. The initial contact was diplomatic and careful. The Velthari's senior envoy to the Terran Assembly was precise about what the coalition was offering: full coalition membership, access to trade relationships and technology-sharing frameworks that humanity had been working toward for decades, and a formal seat on the post-war governance council for the Keth frontier systems. In exchange, soldiers. as many as the Terran Assembly could provide, on whatever timeline was achievable, equipped and supplied by the Coalition since humanity's own military equipment was not, as the Coalition's assessment had determined, at the standard required. For the Keth Theater, the Terran Assembly deliberated for 11 days. The debate in the Assembly chamber was, by all contemporary accounts, genuine. There were real arguments on both sides, and the people making them were serious. The case for joining was straightforward. The offer was good. The alliance with the Velthari coalition would provide lasting strategic benefits, and the Keth, if the coalition failed, were unlikely to stop at the frontier systems. The case against was also straightforward. Humanity was being asked to send its soldiers to fight in a war it had not started, in a theater its military had never trained for, with equipment borrowed from allied species that had been designed for allied species bodies, for goals that the coalition had not fully consulted humanity about. The Assembly voted to join. The margin was not wide. The condition attached to the vote was that humanity's forces would maintain their own command structure within the coalition framework. They would fight alongside Velthari units under joint operational planning, but they would not be subordinated to Velthari officers. They would be attached. They would coordinate. They would not take orders from a chain of command that did not include their own officers. The Velthari coalition accepted this condition with more grace than some of its member species thought was warranted. The Joint Command's internal assessment of the condition was pragmatic. A functional allied force under parallel command was better than no force at all. The first human units arrived at the Keth frontier in USR 3413, 8 months after the Assembly vote. There were 12,000 of them, organized into 6 battalions, accompanied by 41 human officers, and a logistics tale that the Velthari receiving command found, upon review, simultaneously impressive and baffling. The humans had brought things the Coalition had not asked them to bring, and had not brought several things the Coalition had assumed they would bring. When the receiving logistics officer raised this with the human commanding officer, Colonel Essi Mensatuilagi, who would become one of the most significant figures of the war's final phase, she said something that the receiving officer recorded in his incident log and which has been quoted in enough subsequent context to qualify as historic. "We brought what we know we need. Tell me what you think we're missing, and I'll tell you whether we agree." The Velthari Joint Command, reviewing the first human personnel files the following morning, encountered Sergeant First Class Deo Ademiakafer's record and flagged it. His file noted, among other things, 4 tour in high-intensity combat environments, 2 commendations for actions under conditions described by his commanding officers as outside standard tactical parameters, 1 medical record showing injuries from 3 separate engagements that a Velthari military physician, reading the file, noted should statistically have been fatal or incapacitating in at least 2 of the 3 cases, and a psychological assessment from his most recent evaluation that contained a phrase the Velthari analysts translated carefully and then read twice, demonstrates an unusual relationship with physical danger, characterized by reduced stress response and increased cognitive performance under high-threat conditions. Not a risk factor, an asset. Reduced stress response and increased cognitive performance under high-threat conditions. The Velthari did not have a category for this in their soldier evaluation framework. They had categories for courage, which they measured as the willingness to act despite fear. They had categories for discipline, which they measured as adherence to protocols under stress. They did not have a category for what the human assessment was describing, something that was not the absence of fear and not the suppression of fear, but a fundamental neurological recalibration under threat conditions that made the soldier more effective the more dangerous the situation became. They did not have a category for it because it was not a Velthari characteristic. It was a human one. It was a characteristic that 300,000 years of operating as a species in environments that wanted to kill them had selected for, refined. And then, in 16 years of military service in 4 theaters, honed to a particular edge. The weapons issue arose on the second day. The human units had brought their own ballistic weapons, functional, reliable within the range of what the Keth theater's conditions required, but not the energy weapons systems that the Coalition's frontline units used for the majority of their engagements. The Coalition's energy weapons were more effective against Keth defensive armor. The plan had been to equip the human units with Coalition-standard energy weapons once they arrived. The plan encountered the geometry problem. The Velthari grip configuration, evolved for a four-fingered hand with different joint articulation than a human hand, produced a trigger assembly that a human could operate but not safely. Not in high-stress rapid-fire conditions, where the grip pressure required to maintain the weapon's stabilization exceeded what a human hand could sustain without risk of the weapon slipping in the wrong direction at the wrong moment. The adapters were in development. They would take 3 weeks. In the meantime, the logistics officer went to the oldest storage unit in the Coalition's inventory and produced the battered pre-war carbine and brought it to Sergeant Ademi Akafer with genuine apology. He explained the situation. He said they were working on it. He said 3 weeks. He said sorry. 4 seconds of silence, then 7 words. Appoint me at something that needs killing. Colonel Mensatuilagi, briefed on the exchange, noted in her command log that it was the most efficient summary of a soldier's operational philosophy she had encountered in 16 years of service. She also noted, more practically, that the weapons issue was going to require a solution that did not involve waiting 3 weeks, because the Keth frontier's tactical situation was not going to wait 3 weeks. She convened a meeting with the Coalition's Joint Command Operations staff and her own senior officers that afternoon. The meeting produced several things. One of them was a revised operational role for the human units that played to what they had rather than apologizing for what they lacked. The Keth's defensive architecture was its great strength, and as Colonel Mensatuilaga's tactical staff identified within 48 hours of reviewing 6 years of Coalition operational data, its single consistent vulnerability. The positions held. The positions were deep and layered and devastatingly effective at absorbing frontal assault. But the positions had to be supplied. They had to be manned. The soldiers inside them had to sleep. And the Keth, whose defensive doctrine had evolved across 3 previous wars all characterized by large-scale conventional assault, had optimized their positions for exactly that, large-scale conventional assault. What they had not optimized for, what their doctrine had no extensive precedent for, was small unit penetration. Not assault. Penetration. The kind that did not try to take the position but got inside it and made the position untenable from within. This required soldiers who could move through environments that the Keth had designed to be impassable. It required soldiers who could operate for extended periods with minimal support, under conditions that the Keth's automated defensive systems had been calibrated to make maximally hostile. It required soldiers with a particular relationship to physical danger, the kind of relationship that a Velthari logistics officer had, without quite understanding what he was looking at, described in an incident log 4 days earlier. The human units were reassigned from their original role as frontline reinforcement to what the Joint Command's operational planning staff, after a week of debate about terminology, called deep penetration support, a designation that the human soldiers found immediately and universally amusing, which the Velthari staff took as evidence of human communication patterns that required further study. The role was straightforward in concept and extraordinarily demanding in execution. Small teams, 4 to 8 soldiers, moving through Keth defensive territory on missions designed not to take ground but to degrade the Keth's ability to hold it. Supply line interdiction, communication node disruption, defensive system sabotage. And where the opportunity presented and the tactical calculus favored it, the kind of engagement that forced a Keth defensive position to respond to an internal threat, which required it to turn some portion of its defensive capacity inward, which created the opening the coalition's frontline units could exploit. Sergeant Ade Miakafer was assigned to the third team sent behind Keth lines in the second week of human operational deployment. His team was 7 people. Their mission was a communication relay station 17 kilometers inside Keth-held territory, through terrain that the coalition's mapping data classified as Grade 5, the highest hostility rating, reserved for environments where sustained operation was assessed as beyond standard unit capability. The assessment had been made by Velthari standards. The team went anyway. They were inside for 9 days. The relay station was destroyed on day 4. Days 5 through 9 were not technically part of the original mission. The mission had been to reach the station, destroy it, and extract. Extraction on day 4 was not possible. A Keth response unit had moved to cut off the extraction route. The team's options were to hold position and wait for the route to clear, which the Velthari D. Octrine manual specified as the correct response, or to do something else. The team's after-action report filed by Sergeant Ade Miakafer on day 11 after extraction described what happened on days 5 through 9 as adaptive exploitation of available opportunity. The Velthari operational staff reviewing the report read this phrase several times. Then they reviewed the mission data. Then they read the phrase again. In the 9 days the team was inside Keth territory. They destroyed 1 communication relay, disrupted supply delivery to 3 defensive positions, damaged 2 automated sentry systems in ways that the Keth's repair crews would need 4 days to address. And on day 8, in a sequence of events that the after-action report described with such matter-of-fact brevity that the reviewing officer requested a supplementary account, forced the complete evacuation and temporary abandonment of a Keth forward command post by a method that the report characterized as introducing an unmanageable variable into the position's operational calculus. The supplementary account explained what this meant. The reviewing officer read it. Then she went to find Colonel Mensa Tuilagi. The Keth command post had been abandoned because 7 humans with pre-war ballistic carbines had over a period of 6 hours made the position's occupants, a Keth unit of 43, unable to determine where the threat was coming from, how many threats there were, or whether any given location within the position was safe to occupy. They had not killed 43 Keth soldiers. They had made 43 Keth soldiers unable to function as a defensive unit, because the defensive doctrine those soldiers had trained on and relied on and built their positions around had no protocol for a threat that did not assault frontally, did not withdraw when fired upon, did not follow any of the engagement patterns that 6 years of war had established as the coalition's behavioral baseline, and seemed the Keth commander's own log. Recovered when the coalition subsequently took the position, was explicit about this, seemed genuinely unbothered by conditions that the position's automated systems had been calibrated to make unbearable. Seemed genuinely unbothered. The Keth commander had excellent sensors. The data those sensors were producing was accurate. The humans were in conditions that the Keth's modeling said no biological unit could sustain operationally for the duration they were sustaining them. The modeling was not wrong about the conditions. It was wrong about the humans. Colonel Mensa Tuilaga's meeting with the Joint Command's senior operational staff, the morning after she reviewed the supplementary account, was the meeting that changed the war. Not immediately, wars do not change immediately, they change the way rivers change course, gradually and then suddenly, but the meeting was where the change began. She presented the data from the third team's mission alongside data from the first 4 weeks of human operational deployment in aggregate. She presented the pattern. In every engagement where human units had been operating in conditions that the coalition's planning frameworks classified as beyond standard operational parameters, the human units had not performed below standard. They had performed differently from what any existing parameter had predicted. She did not use the word better. She was precise about this, and the precision was intentional. Better implied a comparison on the same scale. What the humans were doing was not better on the Velthari scale. It was operating on a different scale, one that the Velthari framework had not anticipated because the Velthari framework had been built on Velthari parameters, and humans were not Velthari. They were something the framework had no measurements for yet. She told the Joint Command that she needed two things: operational autonomy for human units in deep penetration missions, and 3 weeks to prove a theory. The Joint Command gave her both. It gave her both because the alternative was continuing to fight a 6-year war the same way it had been fought for 6 years, and the 6-year way was losing. The 3 weeks produced data. The data produced a new operational doctrine for the coalition's final phase, one built not around frontal assault on Keth defensive positions, but around the systematic degradation of those positions' ability to function, conducted by human units operating in conditions that the Keth's defensive architecture had not been designed to account for, supported by Velthari units executing the conventional pressure that kept the Keth focused on the threat they knew how to respond to. The doctrine had a formal designation in the Joint Command's operational planning system. The soldiers called it something else. They called it what Sergeant Adamiakafer had called it on day 2 when the logistics officer apologized for the old rifle. They called it finding something that needs killing. The Keth Frontier War ended in USR 3416, 3 years after humanity joined the coalition. The final 18 months of the war looked nothing like the first 6 years. Keth positions that had held for years were abandoned as the cost of holding them became unmanageable, not because the coalition had found a way to assault them more effectively, but because the positions had been made untenable from within by teams that the Keth's doctrine had no good response to, operating in conditions that the Keth systems had been built to make impassable, and that had turned out to be merely uncomfortable. The after-action analysis produced by the Velthari Joint Command in the war's immediate aftermath is a document that military historians have studied extensively, and which this account will not attempt to summarize fully. What it concluded in its core finding was this: the war's final phase had been decided not by the introduction of superior technology or superior numbers or superior strategic positioning, but by the introduction of a form of operational capacity that the existing coalition framework had had no measurements for and had therefore not known to look for. The report's authors were careful to note that this was not a failure of intelligence. The human personnel files had been reviewed, the records had been assessed, the capabilities had been documented. The failure was that the documentation had been filtered through a framework built on different parameters, and the framework had not known what to do with data that didn't fit its categories, and had therefore processed it correctly and drawn the wrong conclusions from it. The weapons adapter program, for what it is worth, was completed on schedule. The human units received coalition standard energy weapons 22 days after arrival. Most of them kept the old carbines as well. Sergeant Adamiakafer carried both for the remainder of the war. His after-action reports consistently described the carbine as adequate for most situations he encountered. His reviewing officers consistently could not determine whether this was a statement about the carbine or about the situations. What the galaxy became in the decades after the Keth Frontier War reflects the war's lessons imperfectly, as the galaxy always reflects lessons, which is to say, some of them took hold and some of them had to be learned again. The Velthari Coalition's Joint Operational Framework was revised to include explicit provisions for multi-species capability assessment, new parameters, new categories, new measurements designed to capture what the old framework had missed. Humanity's military was formally recognized as a full coalition partner, not an attached auxiliary, in the treaty framework that ended the war. The post-war Governance Council for the Keth Frontier Systems included a human seat, as the original membership offer had promised. The Keth, for their part, entered a period of negotiated reconstruction that the coalition managed with considerably more patience than its 6 years of warfare might have suggested. The Keth's defensive civilization, faced with the novel experience of having lost a war, turned out to be capable of the same pragmatic adaptation that defensive civilizations always discover when the alternative is worse. They became, in time, a functional member of the expanded coalition. Their positional architecture turned out to have significant civilian applications in infrastructure and habitat construction. Their patience, turned from defense to development, proved to be a genuine asset. The galaxy is occasionally generous in this way. The qualities that make a species dangerous in one context make it valuable in another, if the context changes and the species is still there to change with it. The fundamental misunderstanding of this account is one that every military institution in the galaxy has committed in some form, and which this account does not present as unique to the Velthari. It is this: the assumption that a species' value in a given context can be accurately assessed by measuring it against the parameters that define value in that context, parameters built by and for the species that created them. The Velthari framework measured what Velthari parameters measured. It missed what Velthari parameters could not see. It missed that 300,000 years of operating as a species in environments of genuine existential threat had produced something in human neurology and human culture and human individual psychology that was not a variation on Velthari soldier capability. It was a different kind of capability entirely, one that did not show up as better on the Velthari scale because it was not operating on the Velthari scale. Sergeant Ademi Akafer was asked, in an interview conducted for the Joint Command's historical record 2 years after the war ended, what he had thought W. When the logistics officer handed him the old carbine, he said he had not thought much about it. He said a rifle was a rifle. He said the logistics officer had seemed more upset about it than he was, and he had not wanted to make the situation more difficult for someone who was clearly trying to do right by him. He said the question he had asked, the 7 words, was not bravado. It was practical. He had a weapon. He needed a target. Those were the relevant facts. And everything else was details. The interviewer asked if he had been afraid. Sergeant Ademi Akafer considered the question for a moment. Then he said, "Of course, but fear is information. It tells you the situation is serious. Once you know the situation is serious, the fear has done its job and you can get on with what needs doing." Fear is information. Once it has done its job, you can get on with what needs doing. He had been getting on with what needed doing for 16 years when the logistics officer handed him the old rifle. He would continue getting on with what needed doing for another 22 years after the war, in 3 subsequent postings that each produced records that subsequent analysts would flag for senior review. He retired at 56. His retirement ceremony was attended by the Velthari Joint Command's senior officers, 3 of whom gave speeches. His own remarks were 4 sentences. The 4th sentence was, "Find out what needs doing and do it. The rest is details." If this story moved something in you, if it made you feel what it means to face impossible odds and ask where the enemy is rather than why the odds are impossible, hit that like button right now. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And subscribe and ring the bell because there are more stories like this one and you do not want to miss them.